Good evening, and now continuing, we're going to talk a little bit about the aerial toll house cult in our days. And I want to give a little background, first of all, before we go into more of the details. We're the first of the Holy Fathers to directly refute the aerial toll house teaching was Saint Irenee of Lyon and his Against Heresies. So we realize that this kind of Manichaean Gnosticism was a problem very early in the church. In fact, earlier than most people really seem to think. One of the reasons that some people will accept this aerial toll house teaching, aside from the fact that people like unpleasant things and terror, is because so little is taught about the history of the church. Even many of our priests and hierarchs really have a very scant or sketchy knowledge of the early years and struggles of the Orthodox Church, and even some of the other tragic incidents in the history of the Church. So I'm going to start by looking back again, and now very often there is a tension between the doctrinal theology of the Church and what's called ascetic theology. Ascetic theology is really a code word for Gnosticism, because ascetic theology, as opposed to the doctrinal theology of the Church, always arises from a Gnostic background. Now, we're not talking about the wisdom of the Desert Fathers. We're talking about some of the theology that developed and affected some of the literature, which is called ascetic literature. And even though it might sound unpleasant to some people, knowing the truth about these things has a certain value, because it keeps us from repeating heresies over and over again. And heresies aren't just wrong teaching. They're teachings that undermine the revelation of the mystery of redemption itself and salvation. So this is why they're serious. Undermine really the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's take a look back in the beginnings. St. Anthony the Great was the founder of Orthodox Christian monasticism. He wasn't the founder of monasticism that bore some Christian name, because Manichaean monasticism is older than Orthodox Christian monasticism. Indeed, Hermeticism, or the Hermits, the Anchoritism, really originated with probably the Stoics. There were desert dwellers in this anchorite, philosophical anchoritism before Anthony the Great. And Manichaean monasticism really was the inventor of the cenobium, the idea of the cenobitic monasticism. It was more profound in the Far East. The Far East of the Roman Empire anyway. In Persia, in Bactria, which is now in Afghanistan, in Sogdiana, which is now in Uzbekistan, and of course Mani, when he founded the system in the late 200s, beginning of the 300s, traveled to India and took some ideas and concepts from the Hindu and Buddhist monasticism and system of thinking. But Mani also had a great gift for adapting the language of these various religions to be used in his system. His system was very stable. He borrowed some things from other religious bodies, but most of the time he found a way to insinuate his own secret Gnostic doctrines into these religions through adapting their language and their practices. Now, Manichaean Gnosticism was present in Egypt, along with Egyptian Gnosticism. And there was a back and forth interchange between Manichaean monks or Gnostic monks and monks who were considered Orthodox Christians. They visited each other's monasteries. The boundaries weren't quite so clear and fixed, and there wasn't a real need seen to move beyond the spiritual into looking at doctrinal issues until perhaps Origen. and I think Meletius. And so there was a flux. And Manichaean monks entered into Orthodox monasteries with the intention of confessing the Orthodox faith while inwardly considering it to be purely allegorical and insinuating the secret gnosis or knowledge into these monasteries. Now this certainly affected a lot of the early ascetic literature and profoundly affected what some people call ascetic theology, that is, as opposed to the general theology of the church. This is why some of these so-called ascetic theology diametrically contradicts expressed doctrines of the Orthodox Church. And Marcionism, Marcionite or Marcion, didn't affect quite so much the Orthodox monasticism in the church. Perhaps in some other ways he left traces here and there. Bardesanis and the others, perhaps not. The Ariel Toll House teaching arises directly from Manichaeism and the Egyptian Gnosticism based on Pharaonic religion, which was dualistic also. As many of you will recall, that in ancient Egypt, almost primordial Egypt, when Upper and Lower Egypt, when all the 41 or 42 nomes or city-states were united together to form a central state, it was necessary to incorporate all 42 gnome gods into the system in order to hold the unity of the state. So when a soul departed for the body, and it had to make the voyage or journey to Osiris, it had to pass through the 42 judgment gates, each one occupied by one of these archons or deities, and answer for some moral sin. And the 42 sins that the Egyptians had to answer for were very comprehensive and, in fact, rather impressive in their concepts. Even forcing a woman into sex had to be answered for if you're a man. We'll actually read these a little bit later. Now, the Manichaean system was a little less comprehensive and based to a certain degree on ancient Chaldean astrological system. In ancient Chaldea, there were toll houses down to the underworld, and in the myth of the goddess Easter, or Yanana, when she descended into the underworld, she had to pay tolls at each gate. And there were also toll gates because the Chaldeans recognized 7 astral spheres of 7 planets. The planets they thought were some kind of deities. There was a gate in each of these astral spheres where there was an archon who collected the toll. So when a soul would depart the body, if it was one of the souls that got to go up instead of down, it had to give account at each one of these astral spheres to the archon in order to reach the 7th heaven. That's where we get the expression 7th heaven. This was incorporated into the Manichaean system, and of course it depends on a radical dualism, anthropological dualism, between soul and body. Just as the toll house cult that has infected the Orthodox Church today depends on an anthropological dualism, which has been repeatedly condemned by the Holy Fathers and by council of the Church. And we'll discuss these a little bit later. But this influence of Manichaeism did not stop with the rise of the Persian Empire, and the Mani died in prison under one of the Persian emperors who didn't particularly like his system, although his system became quite strong. Sogdiana all the way through to Uyghurs. The Uyghur Empire, in fact, embraced as a national religion Manichaeism, and it moved into China and had some interchange with Taoism. So we see some relics of Manichaean Christianity and Taoism. So it spread quite widely, and it was manifested again in Bogomilism and Catharism a little later. Now we'll discuss that background in our next broadcast, probably tomorrow, and then we'll go into a further examination of the contradictions between toll houseism and the doctrines of the Orthodox Church.